My name is Emily House. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission and the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation. I am so happy to be here today to talk about the Reconnect story, hopefully give you some lessons learned as well as best practices with regard to engaging adults in higher ed. But what I want to do first is just take it back to where it started. So if everyone will bear with me for a moment, just for the sake of context. In 2013, then Governor Haslam of Tennessee established for the state a very ambitious attainment goal. So Leslie this morning already mentioned North Carolina's attainment goal. Tennessee has one as well. That goal is 55% attainment by the year 2025. We refer to that as the Drive to 55. When we started the Drive to 55 in 2013, we were at about 36% attainment. We're currently at about 43% attainment, so we still have miles to go before we sleep in 2025. But presumably similarly to what the rationale was in North Carolina for setting such a goal, there's a private and a public good to be considered here. So when we think about the state as a whole, we think about the workforce, we think about attracting business, we think about businesses who are already rooted in Tennessee expanding their business and needing a workforce to complement that expansion. But it's also critical that we think about the private good as well, those individuals in the state who do not have an education, have not engaged with higher education, and what the return for them would be. So I will not stand up here and recite a literature review, you're welcome, but there is much research that posits the health outcomes, the civic engagement outcomes, to say nothing of the fiscal and financial outcomes of citizens who are more highly educated than those who are less educated. So really it had to do with not only the state's economy, but really the well-being of Tennesseans, the reason for setting that attainment goal 6 years ago. So the first step after the establishment of the Drive to 55 goal was the Tennessee Promise. This is not a presentation about Tennessee Promise. I imagine most of you are sick of hearing about Tennessee Promise, so I will not do that. But the first big signature initiative of the Drive to 55 was the Tennessee Promise, which is a tuition and fee-free community and technical college program for high school graduates. So you had to graduate from high school, enroll seamlessly into higher education, and you could do so for free. When we were working on Tennessee Promise, two things happened. We worked on it, we launched, it was fantastic, there's been huge take-up, but two things happened. The first was that we did the math, which sounds very simple, but it was actually pretty complicated math. If every single high school senior graduated from high school, enrolled in higher education, graduated from higher education, and stayed in Tennessee to work, we still would not reach the 55% goal. So we needed to think very strategically and very concretely about what other populations we needed to serve and we needed to work with as we thought about that public good, getting the state to 55%. That's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was we were getting a lot of questions, and that the fundamental question, other than how are we going to pay for this, was what about adults? Everybody knows somebody who dropped out of college for personal reasons or for whatever reasons. Everybody knows somebody who never went to college in the first place. And so many of our legislative colleagues, many policymakers, many community members around the time of the Tennessee Promise launch were asking us, what about adults? And so that really got the Higher Education Commission thinking. It got legislators thinking about what next and how do we best serve adults. In 2017, we launched Tennessee Reconnect, which is a free college program, tuition and fee-free college program for adults in Tennessee. So what I would like to do next is just talk a little bit about how the program works, who's eligible for the program, and then a little bit more history about how we got to where we are. So we are currently in the second year of the program. The 18-19 academic year, last year was the first year. We're currently in the third semester, the second year. And I will not bury the lead and say we have seen great success and great take-up and great retention among students who are Reconnect students. So the actual definition of a Reconnect student or the requirements to become a Reconnect student are listed on the slide behind me. These adults cannot have an associate degree or a bachelor's degree. If these adults have a certificate from a technical college or from a community college, they are eligible for this program. If they have a welding certificate or an automotive industry certificate, whatever it might be, they are eligible, but you cannot already have an associate degree or a bachelor's degree. Rather than put an age limit on this, rather than say you need to be 25 or older, 24 and older, we define an adult as somebody who is independent on the FAFSA. So when they file for financial aid, if they're able to file as an independent student, that is the type of student who qualifies for Reconnect. That can be a student with a dependent, that can be a military-affiliated student who might be a little bit younger than the typical 24 or 25. You need to be a Tennessee resident for at least 1 year. That is consistent with all of the other state financial aid. You need to create a success plan, which I'll get back to in 1 second. And finally, you need to enroll at least half-time. So when we think about adults who are thinking about going back to school, their lives are complicated. And that is not to say that a student graduating from high school does not have a complicated life. But I would argue, and I would bet, that adults thinking about taking advantage of Reconnect have much more complicated lives. They have employment obligations, they have family obligations, they may have children, they may have aging parents, whatever it might be. So the requirement is that they enroll half-time rather than full-time, which is the requirement for Tennessee Promise. They need to enroll full-time. But Reconnect students need to enroll for at least 6 credits each term, and that is half-time status. Another important element of Tennessee Promise for the high school students is that they're required to meet with a mentor. We did not implement the mentorship component directly mirroring how we do it for Promise for Reconnect because of what I just said about adults having complicated lives and having other obligations. So in lieu of that, what we ask these adults to do is complete a success plan. What sort of resources do you need? What are your aspirations? How many courses do you think you can take each term? Will you be working while enrolled? Do you have reliable transportation, etc.? That information comes to THEC and is blasted out to the appropriate parties at the institutions at which the students enroll. So rather than having a traditional mentor kind of relationship with someone, they fill out this plan and they have access to a network of staff and a network of navigators. So when we think about students in high school, they're a pretty captive audience, right? You can go to the guidance counselor, you can go to the school cafeteria, you can give a presentation on college night, and that's how you can access all of these students who are still in high school to talk to them about going to college. The question then about these adults is, where do we find them? Everybody's asking, what about adults? And everybody knows somebody who needs to go back to college, but how do we find these people and how do we get them to re-engage? There are 900,000 adults in Tennessee with some college, no degree, to say nothing of those who never engaged with higher ed in the first place. So how do we find those 900,000? How do we find those who never engaged in the first place? And these are some strategies that we used to do so. We did very targeted, very strategic social media. That's a screenshot of the Twitter page there on the slide. We put billboards up on the highway. That's that image below the Twitter feed. We literally, on the highway, rented billboard space and put up a billboard that looks like the one right here on the screen. So an adult driving to work, perhaps they're driving to a job that they are not excited about, they wish they could do something else, they're going to see this on their commute. We did radio ads. We did television ads. That is not something we did for the Promise program or for any other financial aid program. But we put ads on TV, we put ads on the radio. Again, you're driving to work in the morning and you hear this commercial about this program and you think, maybe that's something I would want to do. From the community side, we engaged with churches, we engaged with Rotaries, chambers of commerce, to really get out into the community and say, we all know that you all know someone who could benefit from a program like this. So how do we re-engage these folks to get them back in? We've worked very closely with other state agencies, the Department of Human Services, the Department of Labor, thinking about those adults in Tennessee who are accessing public benefits or other services. How can we re-engage them or engage them for the first time in higher ed? It's a very coordinated effort in that regard. And a question that I often get is, how do you all work together? So is Tennessee really this utopia with like unicorns and lollipops and everybody loves each other and works together and everybody goes to college for free? I know some of you are thinking that. I know you're thinking that. And the truth is no, we have plenty of issues and we have plenty of challenges that we're continuing to work through. But a challenge that we have not typically had is the collaboration between state agencies. And that is a testament to the leadership of those state agencies, legislative leadership, and gubernatorial leadership. There is not a lot of turf in this regard, particularly when all of these initiatives are so rooted in this state goal of attainment. So nobody from the Department of Labor is saying, we don't want to talk to you about how to engage adults in higher ed when they're collecting unemployment. Nobody from the Department of Human Services is saying, no, THEC, we don't want to talk to you about those who are receiving SNAP or TANF, whatever it might be. It's very collaborative, and that's been a very, very important piece of the work that we've done. The same is true of local workforce boards. We have gone into communities, community leaders have come to us, and we have said to them, what do you need? What does the workforce in your community need? And how can higher education get you what you need? Higher education is not particularly known for being nimble. How can we be more nimble to meet the needs of the workforce in your community? So in 2016 is when we brought this in front of the legislature. It was 2017, I'm sorry. It was implemented in 2018. We brought this in 2017 in front of the legislature. And expectations were pretty low. They were pretty low legislatively. They were pretty low policy-wise in general. Unemployment in Tennessee is very low. A lot of these adults are working. Even if they do not have a higher education degree or a post-secondary credential, they are in the workforce. So we assumed that about 12,000 people would apply for the program. Maybe about 8,000 would enroll, cost about $10 million, and we'll see what happens from there. And even that was met with skepticism. A lot of legislators, a lot of community leaders thought we were crazy. They thought we were crazy. We know you guys did a great job with Promise, those high school kids, that's great, but these adults are working, they're not going to want to go back to school. And I have one joke in this presentation, and you're about to hear it, which is, get ready, I wrote the fiscal note for this bill. So for my legislators in the room and my legislative staff in the room, you know how critical that is and how fundamental that is when you're trying to have these conversations. I wrote the fiscal note assuming that 12,000 would apply, 8,000 would enroll. It would end up costing us, after all the other aid is applied, about $10 million. And I have never been so wrong in my career. Now, it's funny now. The budget office doesn't think it's funny. The people writing the checks don't think it's funny, but this is what happened. This is what happened fall of 2018. We had over 40,000 adults apply and almost 20,000 enroll. So on one hand, I really screwed up that fiscal note. On the other hand, I've never been so proud to screw up a fiscal note because there is clearly an appetite for this, and these adults want to go back. They want to engage in higher education, and they want to be thinking about the ways in which their lives can be improved should they engage with higher education. Now, because of this, and because of some other elements I'm about to mention, the cost was a lot higher than we thought it was going to be. This is for a couple of reasons. One, this is more than double the number of adults we thought would enroll. Something that was much harder to quantify, though, was how much aid these adults would be eligible for outside of the Reconnect program. Would they have exhausted their aid engaging in higher education earlier in their lives? Would they have some kind of debt that they've not repaid? Are they in default? We could not really accurately estimate how much this was going to cost, again, in a way that we were able to do for Promise. There were a lot of great lessons learned in terms of Promise, but we couldn't apply every single one of them. So a challenge that we are continuing to face today, because again, it's not all unicorns and puppy dogs in Tennessee, is how do we sustain this program when it is more costly than we thought it was going to be, but it's also having to do with remediating some of the loan debt or the student loan default and some of the other challenges that these adults have with regard to their past education experiences. So more to come on that, but what I would encourage you all to do, if anything like this is something that's being considered in this state, is to think very concretely about that piece of it, how to engage with adults who are in default or who have had experiences in the past that render them ineligible for federal aid. That has real consequences for the cost of your program, and I would invite any best practices or any genius ideas the state of North Carolina comes up with, bring those to me in Tennessee because I will appreciate you forever, and I'll give you credit. So here are just a few testimonials when we think about the private good of programs like this. Working at the state level, it's very important sometimes to zoom out and think about the individuals who are being served. I can talk to you until I'm blue in the face about employer recruitment, industry recruitment, what type of workforce do these certain industries need in order to grow our economy in Tennessee, which is critical and important, and I don't mean to imply otherwise. But really, what is just so fundamental and so fulfilling is when you hear testimonies like these three up here. This program is changing lives, and I don't say that in a way that is self-inflated or in a way that is self-congratulatory, but this is really a program that is changing the lives of people in Tennessee who maybe thought college isn't for me. They thought I had my one shot at going to the University of Tennessee. It didn't work out 20 years ago, so now I'm just done. Really re-engaging in a very strategic way that's been very powerful for not only the state, but for individuals in the state. Okay, so over 40,000 people applied for Tennessee Reconnect, about 20,000 enrolled. What happened to those half that did not enroll? So like any good researcher, like any good data steward, we have data on these people. We know who applied and we know who did not ultimately show up in the fall 18 semester. We'll know pretty soon who showed up in the fall 19 semester. And there were a few big points that came out when we surveyed these folks. So we reached out to those who didn't enroll and we said, why didn't you enroll? We still have your information. You are still eligible for this program. We want you to come back. Why didn't you enroll? And the first answer was probably the most consistent, and that is that they couldn't get their lives in order, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, get their lives in order in a way that would allow them to go back to school as quickly as they had hoped. I mentioned a moment ago there could be transportation constraints, there could be childcare constraints, constraints related to their work, that they couldn't quite make it happen for the fall 18 semester. And our response to that is, how can we help? What can the state do? What can the institutions do to help you with what you need? Related to that is the third bullet, having to do with the cost of not tuition and not fees. Thinking about childcare, thinking about housing, thinking about transportation. Now, we can talk all day long about the benefits and the costs of a program such as Reconnect that is last dollar, that does not include housing, that does not include cost of attendance. It's tuition and fee free. However, we have worked with these other state agencies. We are working with foundations. We are working with the campuses and the campus foundations across the state to try to alleviate some of these fears and some of these additional costs, again, related to food, housing, childcare, transportation, et cetera. If anyone's familiar with the term microgrant or retention grants, we're working a little bit in that regard to alleviate some of those concerns for these adults. So I guess I have two jokes. It's your lucky day. Nobody's laughing at the fact that I have two jokes. So we always joke that nobody graduates from the Higher Education Commission because that's true. Nobody graduates from THEC. Folks graduate from our institutions. So something that we're working with our institutions to improve or to change is the second bullet here. Can you offer more courses in the evening? Can you have courses on the weekends? Can you keep your offices open from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. a couple nights a week for those adults who need to come in the evening after they work? This was a barrier for a lot of these potential Reconnect students, and so we're working with our campuses to alleviate that stress and make a change that can get more students enrolled. So in conclusion, I'll go back to where I started, related to the public and the private good. Both are so important, critical to the state and the state's economy, as well as the individuals who live in Tennessee. So from the public side, this program, as well as Tennessee Promise, have been critical as we've thought about economic development throughout the state. No longer are employers asking only about tax incentives. And I know that because I've been in some of these meetings. Who sends the higher ed researcher to a pitch meeting? I don't know, but I have been in these meetings, and I've heard how the conversations have changed over the 6 years that I've been at the Higher Ed Commission. So when we think about relocation and attracting other business, we think about expansion. The conversation about the workforce has become just so fundamental. As Promise changed the college-going conversation for students coming right out of high school, Reconnect has done the same for these adults. These adults who thought, as I said, they had their one shot and they blew it for whatever reason. They were 19 and didn't know how to be a student who was successful. They thought they blew it. They didn't blow it. Nobody has blown it now that these programs are in place. Students who are coming right out of high school thinking about promise may have parents or aunts and uncles or cousins or even grandparents who want to go back themselves. Someone mentioned earlier the idea of two-generational change or multi-generational change. This is an example of that in a very pragmatic, a very tactical form. When we talk to high school students about filing the FAFSA, we're talking to their parents as well. And finally, what ultimately happens here is that very often for these families, this can break the cycle of poverty. These adults are able to get different jobs, they're able to earn higher wages, and they're able to support their families in different ways.